The man smelled like gasoline and sweat. His hands trembled slightly as he handed over the receipt, but his voice remained calm. "I just need it back by Monday," he said. The teenage clerk laughed. "Sir, this lawnmower is older than me. What are you going to do, mow a battlefield?" The old man smiled faintly, adjusting the Marine Corps cap on his head. 3 days later, every single piece of lawn in the town's cemetery had been perfectly trimmed. But no one knew who had left the metal on the grave. Not yet. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to like the video. It was just after 7 a.m. when Thomas Holbrook pulled into the parking lot of Greenridge Supply and Rental in the quiet town of Elliston, Kentucky. The spring fog still clung to the ground, and the air carried the wet scent of dew and freshly cut grass. Thomas moved slower these days. At 82, his knees ached with each step, but his back remained straight, shoulders squared the way the Corps had taught him over half a century ago. He wore a brown flannel shirt, khaki trousers, and an old USMC ball cap that had faded to a color somewhere between tan and memory. No one really noticed him, just another old man in a town full of them. Inside the store, a teenage boy leaned on the counter, earbuds in, scrolling through his phone. Thomas cleared his throat. "Morning." The boy didn't look up. "Yeah, I'm here for the push mower I rented. Should be under Holbrook." "Uh-huh," the teen said, still tapping his screen. "You sure? There's, for orders from this week." Thomas reached into his shirt pocket and carefully unfolded a slip of paper. "Here's the receipt." The boy took it without much interest, glancing at the smudged ink. "Dang, you really rented that old Toro? I didn't think anyone touched that one." He snorted. "Sir, that thing's older than I am. What are you going to do, mow a battlefield?" There was no malice in the boy's tone, just the careless cockiness of someone who hadn't yet buried friends or watched history bleed into silence. Thomas smiled politely. "Something like that," he said. He paid in cash, small bills, neatly counted. As he pushed the rust-red mower onto his trailer, a man in overalls walked by and gave him a nod. "Still cutting your own grass, Tom? You're tougher than the rest of us." "Not my grass," Thomas replied. He strapped down the mower and climbed into his truck with a grunt. He drove through the winding back roads of Elliston, past rows of blooming dogwoods and the faded sign for Rock Hollow Cemetery. He didn't glance at the houses or the children waiting for school buses. His eyes stayed forward, focused. The cemetery sat on a quiet ridge overlooking the valley. Nobody had mowed it in weeks, maybe longer. Wild grass waved in the morning breeze, brushing against toppled stones and plastic flowers faded by sun and time. Thomas parked at the bottom of the hill, pulled out his gloves, and got to work. He didn't rush. He never had. One row at a time. One grave at a time. No one noticed the old man pushing a mower through forgotten grass. Not yet. The first few rows were the worst. Overgrown weeds, crumbling edging, the sunken earth of unvisited graves. But Thomas never paused. His left leg dragged slightly, a limp earned decades ago in a place no one in Elliston remembered, but his path through the cemetery was measured, precise. By midday, his flannel shirt was soaked through, and his hands bore new blisters on top of old calluses. He took water breaks sparingly, sitting beneath the oak tree near the southern fence line. From that spot, he could see the grave that brought him here every year. Not his own family plot. Not his wife's. That one belonged to a boy named Parker T. Delaney, Private First Class. Killed in action, 1968. Quang Tri Province. Thomas never met him during the war, but he knew the story. Delaney had been 19, born and raised in Elliston. The town didn't hold a parade for him when he came home, because he never came home. His body did, in pieces. The government sent a check and a box and moved on. His parents were buried just uphill. No siblings. No one left to remember. Except Thomas. He stood now at Delaney's grave, sweat dripping from his chin, and slowly reached into his pocket. From within a folded piece of waxed cloth, he drew a single brass button, greened at the edge from age. It had once belonged to Delaney's field jacket. Thomas found it after a medevac run in '68, half buried in the mud, near a place the maps just called Hill 310. It had been in his possession ever since. "I figured you'd like to see the sun again," Thomas said quietly, placing the button on the headstone. "It's Memorial Day weekend, Parker. Town still doesn't know you. But I do." He didn't hear the boy approach. "Sir? Are you okay?" Thomas turned. It was the teenage clerk from the rental shop, helmetless on a mountain bike, looking sheepish. "I saw your truck. Thought you might need help loading the mower." Thomas studied him for a long moment. Didn't expect company. The boy hesitated. I Googled you. After you left. That earned the old man's first real smile of the day. You find anything interesting? The boy shrugged. There's not much. A couple old clippings. A unit photo. Your name came up on a casualty list, but marked wounded, survived. That's about right. I didn't mean to be rude. Earlier, the boy added, kicking at the dirt. I just thought you were. An old man with a mower? Yeah. Thomas nodded. And now, I think I was wrong. The breeze carried the smell of cut grass and turned earth. The silence stretched. Then Thomas asked, You want to help with the next row? The boy blinked. You mean mow? I mean walk between the names no one reads. The boy nodded. Without another word, he followed Thomas to the next headstone and took his place. Have you ever misjudged someone, only to realize later they carried more strength than you imagined? How did that change you? They worked for another 2 hours. Passers-by and SUVs slowed but didn't stop. A few neighbors looked from porches, then returned to their coffee. No one offered water. No one asked questions. At 5:20 p.m., Thomas shut off the mower. He removed his cap, placed it over his heart, and closed his eyes. The boy stood beside him. Is this the last one? Thomas opened his eyes. No, just the last for today. If you believe respect shouldn't wear out with time, type respect. As they walked back to the truck, the boy looked at the empty space on the trailer where the mower had been. Hey, did you hear that? Thomas paused. The sound was faint, like metal clinking against stone. They turned. Someone had placed fresh flags on the far graves. All in a line, all facing east. Who did that? The boy whispered. But Thomas didn't answer. He was already moving forward again, the tired weight in his steps shifting into something quieter. Not lighter, but steadier. If you know someone who quietly carries others, share their story in the comments. Even when the world forgets, we remember. By Sunday morning, word had started to spread. Not through the news, not through any official post or public notice, just murmurs. A clerk at Greenridge said some old guy was mowing the cemetery alone. A woman who jogged past the gates each morning noticed the grass was suddenly shorter, neater. The headstones were visible again. Even the toppled ones had been gently lifted back into place with wooden braces someone must have fashioned by hand. Nobody said it out loud, but there was a subtle tension moving through Elliston. The kind that made people glance a little longer at the cemetery when they drove by. The kind that made a few folks feel ashamed, though they couldn't quite name why. Thomas Holbrook didn't care for gossip. He arrived just after sunrise, parked in the shade, and pulled out a second mower from the bed of his truck. This one smaller, older, with a frame he'd reinforced himself back in '94. He brought a rake, a spool of twine, even a sharpened pair of shears. The air was heavier now. Storms were forecasted by evening. He wanted to finish before the rain came. The boy was already waiting by the fence, holding 2 thermoses. He waved awkwardly when he saw Thomas. Brought coffee. Thomas took it without a word and gave a small nod of gratitude, then handed the boy a rake. They started on the upper quadrant of the cemetery, where the veterans from World War II and Korea lay. Here, the markers were granite, not marble, faded but firm. Names like Howard, Lehman, Frazier. So many born between 1920 and 1935. So many who died far from home. Thomas didn't need a map. He knew where every one of them rested. Sir? The boy asked, working beside him. Can I ask, why do you do all this? Thomas didn't answer right away. Instead, he knelt beside a headstone so weathered it looked like a ghost. He cleared the moss from the lettering with a small brush. This one, he said, finally, used to play the harmonica. Loudly. Off-key. You could hear him 3/10 down. The boy frowned. You knew him? I knew them all. Thomas moved to the next grave. Some men come home with medals. Some come home with silence. I was one of the lucky ones. I got to grow old. Sit under a tree. Smell cut grass. They didn't. For a moment, the boy just stood there, rake hanging limp in his hands. I never thought about that, he said quietly. I mean, I knew people died in war. But I never thought about who remembered them after. Thomas gave him a long look. Most people don't. What moment in your life did justice arrive late, but sweet? Share your story in the comments. By midday, the sun beat down hard. Their shadows grew shorter. The storm clouds hadn't arrived yet, but the pressure had shifted. Birds flew lower. The wind lost its edge. That's when the first car pulled in. Then another. Then a minivan. People emerged, hesitant, eyes scanning the freshly mowed cemetery like they'd never truly seen it before. One woman knelt beside her grandfather's grave and gasped softly. Someone had polished the plaque. A veteran in a denim vest saluted silently toward the southeast row and left a coin on a marker. None of them said much, just quiet gestures, touches, nods, as if they were all remembering something they hadn't known they'd forgotten. If this makes you angry, type respect in the comments. The boy glanced at Thomas. Did you invite them? Thomas shook his head. Didn't have to. They kept working. A few of the new arrivals offered to help. One man brought a weed trimmer. A teenager ran home for garbage bags and gloves. By 3 p.m., there were 14 people spread across the cemetery, raking, trimming, brushing off moss, and fixing what they could. No speeches. No hashtags. Just hands in dirt. If you've ever witnessed someone punished for doing the right thing, thank them today, even if it's just in the comments. At 4:15, a drop of rain struck the handle of the rake. Then another. Within minutes, the sky broke open and rain poured down in sheets. But nobody left. The volunteers kept working, drenched, mudslick, shoes ruined. Thomas, soaked to the bone, moved a final piece of edging into place beside a stone that simply read, Baby Eleanor, 1944. The boy reached into his backpack and pulled out a small American flag, the kind they hand out at parades. Without a word, he stuck it into the fresh earth beside her name. Seemed like she deserved one, too. Thomas looked at him, and for the first time, his eyes glistened. He didn't wipe them. Have you known someone like that? Someone who carries others quietly, without asking for thanks? Share their name below. Monday morning brought a strange hush over Elliston. The storm had passed, leaving the streets rinsed and shining. But it wasn't just the rain that made people quieter than usual. It was the feeling that something had shifted. Something they couldn't name. The town cemetery, for the first time in years, looked alive. The grass was even. The headstones clean. Small flags fluttered across every veteran's grave like a quiet salute from a town that had finally remembered. And yet, no one knew who to thank. Not officially. The boy, Caleb, as Thomas had finally learned, had tried to tell his parents, but they barely listened. That's nice, his mother said, tapping on her phone. Maybe the town council hired someone. They hadn't. Thomas hadn't returned the rental mower. And that morning, a concerned employee from Greenridge drove out to his house to check. No answer. The trailer was parked out front, empty. The grass in his yard hadn't been cut. The porch light was still on. At 7:42 a.m., the Greenridge employee called the police. At 8:06, an officer knocked on Thomas Holbrook's door. At 8:19, the coroner arrived. And by 9 o'clock, the news began to ripple across Elliston like a breath held too long. Thomas Holbrook had passed away quietly in his sleep, sometime during the night. Heart failure. Peaceful. Alone. He'd made no calls. Left no notes. Just one small envelope, taped to the inside of his front door, labeled in neat block letters, in case someone cares. Inside were two things. A letter. And a medal. The letter was addressed not to a person, but to the town. To Elliston, and whoever still walks its roads. It told the story of Parker Delaney, of the cemetery, and the names he'd come to know better than the living. It told of noise and silence, of medals never claimed, and of the promise he'd made long ago to never let the forgotten stay forgotten. It ended simply. I was never anyone important, but I carried their stories. And if that's all I did with the time I had left, it was enough. Thomas Holbrook, USMC, read. The medal was a silver star. Have you ever known someone who gave everything and asked nothing in return? If so, type their name below. Let them be remembered. Caleb was the one who found out first. A knock on his door. His parents went pale, assuming trouble. But when they heard, the silence that followed wasn't fear. It was wait. Later that afternoon, Caleb biked to the cemetery alone. The grass was already growing back. But there, near the southeast corner, someone had placed the silver star in the soil pressed carefully beside Parker Delaney's grave. No one had claimed it. No one dared move it. And beside it, a new stone had appeared. Small, gray, barely noticeable. But Caleb read the name, and the breath caught in his throat. Thomas E. Holbrook, 1939 to 2025. Semper Fi. He remembered. If you believe those who sacrificed for others deserve to be honored every day, subscribe to us, where we tell the stories that should have been appreciated long ago. Because quiet heroes never stop serving. A week passed. Then something remarkable happened. One by one, people began visiting the cemetery. Not for their families. Not for tradition. For Thomas. A young couple brought their baby and laid flowers at his stone. A man in a sheriff's uniform stood for over an hour, hat in hand. A group of high school students cleaned the paths. Someone built a bench, carved with the words, "In case someone cares." Veterans from towns over started showing up too. Word had spread beyond Elliston. Marine Corps patches appeared on jackets. Old men saluted in silence. The boy, Caleb, began mowing the grass every Sunday. Not because anyone told him to. Because it was the right thing to do. What would you do if your mother or father were remembered only in silence? If you believe remembering is the least we can do, type "never forget" in the comments. And then came the day Caleb noticed something strange, an envelope taped under the bench. No name. Just a folded piece of paper and another medal. A purple heart. No note. Just a sentence, written in a trembling hand. "I served with Holbrook. He saved me. Thought you should have this." Have you ever seen one act of kindness ripple outward like a tide? If so, tell us how below. Let the world know good things don't disappear, they echo. The cemetery had changed. Not because someone made a law, but because one man with a limp and an old mower chose to do what no one else would. To remember. It was Thursday when the government van rolled into Elliston. No sirens. No flags. Just a dark sedan followed by a gray Suburban with government plates and dust on the tires. 3 men stepped out at the town hall, 2 in suits, 1 in marine dress blues. They asked for the mayor. And then, for Caleb. Word spread quickly. That afternoon, Caleb stood nervously in front of the town's small memorial plaza, flanked by a crowd of curious onlookers. The Marine, a full bird colonel with silver hair and a presence that silenced even children, stepped forward. He spoke only once. Thomas Holbrook never submitted for honors. Never requested recognition. But we reviewed his records. He turned to Caleb, who stood holding a folded flannel shirt, the one Thomas had worn every Sunday. You were the last to stand beside him. He left no family. So, this is yours to receive. From a case lined with velvet, the colonel lifted a second silver star. Then a presidential unit citation. And then, quietly, a small patch of fabric, faded green, sewn with the numbers 3/5. The same battalion that fought at Hugh, Kisan, and Fallujah, the colonel said. Sergeant Holbrook was there when others weren't. We owe him more than we gave. The crowd stood silent. Then someone clapped. Then another. Within moments, the plaza echoed with applause that Thomas would never hear, but surely would have shrugged off anyway. Caleb didn't speak. He just clutched the medals, his young hands trembling. Have you ever known someone who left behind more than just memories, someone who left behind purpose? Share their name with us in the comments. The next day, the town school hosted a writing assignment. Who do you remember? The entries were raw, honest. One read, I never knew Mr. Holbrook, but I walked past his bench, so I know him now. Another, he mowed for my granddad's grave. I didn't even know we had family there. Someone wrote, he didn't tell stories. He just made sure they weren't forgotten. If this makes you feel something you can't quite explain, type dignity in the comments. By Sunday, the cemetery had a new visitor. A woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a quiet step. She carried a cane and wore a navy ball cap. She walked the rows, paused by Holbrook's stone, knelt, painfully, then left a worn letter folded beneath the silver star in the grass. Nobody opened it, but they didn't move it either. Have you ever misjudged a stranger, only to realize they were exactly who the world needed? If so, share their story. Someone else may need it. That night, Caleb sat by the bench, watching dusk settle over the hills. The flannel shirt was beside him. His shoes were muddy. From behind, a soft voice broke the silence. Mind if I sit? It was the woman. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. Thomas taught me how to clean a rifle, she said after a long pause. Didn't care I was a girl. Said the dirt didn't know the difference. Caleb smiled faintly. He ever tell you about the one thing he was scared of? Caleb shook his head. Being forgotten. She looked out over the graves. Guess we fixed that. If you believe quiet men can make the loudest difference, type always remember in the comments. A month passed. Elliston returned to its usual rhythm. Church bells on Sundays, slow walkers on Main Street, the sound of high school practice drifting across the football field. But the cemetery was different now. Something had taken root, and it wasn't just grass. It was habit. Every Saturday morning, someone new arrived. Not from obligation. From memory. One brought flowers. Another swept the gravel paths. A father taught his daughter how to read the names on headstones like a storybook. The mayor, moved by the growing tide of respect, issued a simple ordinance. The town would maintain the cemetery year-round, no excuses. But it wasn't a law that changed Elliston. It was one man with a limp and a lawnmower. Caleb came every weekend. Sometimes he worked. Sometimes he just sat. Once, he left his school medal for math regionals tucked behind Holbrook's headstone, not because it mattered to anyone, but because he thought Thomas might have liked to know. It rained that day. He didn't leave. Have you ever given something small to someone gone, just so they'd know you remembered them? Tell us what it was in the comments. It matters more than you think. Then came Memorial Day. The sun rose early over the hills. Fog clung low, wrapping the cemetery like a breath held in silence. Before 6 a.m., cars began pulling up, some old and sputtering, others spotless and black. Some bore state plates. Others didn't. By 9 a.m., over 200 people had gathered among the rows. Veterans, families, strangers. No band, no press, just people. And then footsteps. Rhythmic, coordinated, familiar. The crowd parted as a formation of Marines emerged from the eastern path. 8 in total. Boots polished to mirror shine. Uniforms exact. At their center walked Colonel David Morrow, flanked by 2 generals and a civilian in a dark suit. Caleb saw him first. He stood straighter without realizing it. His shirt was tucked in, hair combed back. He didn't expect to be called forward, but he was. "Mr. Caleb Harris," the colonel said, voice even and carrying. "Step forward." Caleb did. "On behalf of the Department of Defense, the United States Marine Corps, and the quiet debt this country carries, we present to you the United States flag in honor of Sergeant Thomas E. Holbrook, folded by the hands of those he once trained." 2 Marines stepped forward, unfolding a triangle of crisp cotton. The colonel placed it in Caleb's arms. "You stood beside him when no one else did," he said. "That matters." Caleb blinked back tears. If this moment moved you, if it reminded you of someone you once lost, type their initials in the comments. Let their names live again. Behind them, a bugler raised his trumpet. Taps echoed across the field, pure and aching. A baby cried. Someone placed a trembling hand on their chest. And there, at the back of the crowd, stood a man no one recognized. Mid-60s. Beard. Faded tattoos on both forearms. He wore a tan jacket and held something small in his hands. After the bugle faded, he stepped forward silently. In his palm was a photograph, black and white, worn at the corners. It showed 3 young men in Vietnam fatigues. One of them was unmistakably Holbrook, his smile crooked, hand resting on a fellow soldier's shoulder. The man knelt and placed the photo beside the silver star. Then whispered, "You kept your promise, Tommy." He stood, gave one final salute, and walked away before anyone could ask his name. Have you ever seen someone disappear quietly, leaving behind more than they took? Share your moment. Because silence, too, is sacred. By noon, the cemetery had emptied. Flags fluttered. Flowers swayed. The sun warmed the stone bench where it all began. Caleb sat there, flag in his lap, hands still. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. Sometimes, presence says everything. If someone once carried you through the dark, even when no one else saw it, type "never forgotten" in the comments. And subscribe to hear more stories like this. Because quiet heroes never stop serving. Summer thickened over Elliston, laying a warm hush over the hills and fences, the streets and barns. Life moved on, of course it did, but a new tradition had crept into the bones of the town. A kind of reverence that didn't need explanation. And it all led back to the bench. More than a memorial, it had become a place of exchange. People left things. Not flashy or loud, but deeply personal. A bronze star pin. A folded church bulletin with a boy's name underlined in red ink. A plastic harmonica, chipped at one edge. A slice of someone's life, laid down like an offering. It was the librarian, Miss Henley, who suggested the ledger. She found an old guest book in the back room of the town library. Thick paper, leather spine, pages slightly warped from time. She set it on the bench one morning in early July with a small sign. If they matter to you, write their name. By noon, the first entry had appeared. Then 5. Then 12. Soon, every page bore stories. Not dates. Not politics. Just names and fragments. Corporal Dean Harwood taught me how to fish. Lieutenant Grace Nguyen sang off key on purpose. My brother Jake, he carried me through Dad's funeral. People came from other towns. Then other states. The ledger grew full. And beside it always sat Caleb. Not because he had to, but because he knew someone needed to hold that space open. One morning, an elderly woman arrived just after sunrise. She wore a pale blue dress and carried nothing but a manila envelope. She sat without speaking. After an hour, she turned to Caleb. "Did you know Thomas well?" He shook his head. "Not until the end." She smiled gently. "Then you knew the best part." She opened the envelope. Inside were letters, all addressed to families of men listed on the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. None had stamps. He wrote one every year, for the ones who didn't come home. But he never mailed them. Caleb's eyes widened. Why? He thought maybe it would feel like asking for something in return. She placed the envelope in his lap. "They should be read, even if it's just once. If you believe words have weight, even the ones never sent, type carry their stories in the comments." That night, Caleb brought the letters to the library. Miss Henley helped archive them. One by one, they read each aloud, whispered to the shelves and ceiling. Not broadcast, not published, just heard. One letter simply read, "Dear Mom, your son's saying to keep us calm. He was terrified, but he smiled so we wouldn't be. I don't know what you told him to believe in, but whatever it was, he died believing it mattered. Have you ever read a sentence that changed the way you saw the world? Share the line below. Let it ripple further than it was meant to." The bench began to fill with more than memories. Veterans who had never spoken of their time began to share their names in the ledger. Grandchildren asked questions. Parents answered them. And slowly, the silence that Holbrook had carried began to dissolve not into noise, but into understanding. On a rainy Thursday, a boy from the high school left his ROTC ribbon there. No one touched it. But when Caleb arrived at dawn the next day, someone had placed a single dog tag beside it. No name, just the word, guide. If someone once lit the path for you in your darkest hour, even without knowing it, type light remains in the comments. That summer, the cemetery became more than a place to bury the dead. It became a place to keep them alive. By the end of August, Elliston had changed. Not in ways a map would show. The buildings still leaned, the sidewalks still cracked, and the church bell still rang flat on humid Sundays. But people looked each other in the eye more often. They stopped for longer hellos. They remembered. The cemetery's bench, Thomas Holbrook's bench, had become the quiet heart of the town. Not out of obligation, but out of recognition. And on the first day of September, something unexpected arrived. A letter. Official-looking. Thick envelope. Gold seal. It was addressed to the people of Elliston. Postmarked from Washington, D.C. The mayor read it aloud beneath the sycamore tree near the cemetery gate, her voice steady but trembling at the edges. It was from the Secretary of Defense. It read, "The Department of Defense formally acknowledges the civic actions taken by the citizens of Elliston, Kentucky, in preserving and honoring the legacy of Sergeant Thomas E. Holbrook, USMC, Red, and the men and women whose memory he carried. This town has demonstrated what national remembrance should look like. Not in marble, in action." The letter closed with a single line. "Let the grass keep growing, and let the stories never stop." The crowd applauded. Not for themselves. For him. But the town wasn't done. That same month, the local school board renamed Elliston Middle School. It would now be called Holbrook Academy for Civic Leadership. They unveiled a new sign carved from reclaimed oak. Beneath the name, in small script, "Character is measured when no one is watching." Students planted dogwood trees across the grounds, one for each name in the cemetery's ledger. By winter, the bench was still there, still watched over, still warm with memory. Miss Henley had collected enough letters and stories to publish a book, though she didn't sell it. It sat in the library, bound in dark green leather, marked simply, Thomas Holbrook, the names he remembered. Caleb's name appeared in the preface, alongside a photo of the bench and a note that read, "For the boy who stayed." Have you ever stood quietly by someone's side and realized later it was the most important thing you ever did? Share your moment below. Others may need the reminder. The winter was hard. Ice came early. But the paths in the cemetery never froze, because someone always salted them. No one ever said who. On Veterans Day, the town held its first candlelight vigil. Over 300 people came, from 4 counties. Some wore medals, some wore silence. Caleb lit the first candle, then passed the flame down the line. They didn't read names that night. They didn't need to. The light was enough. If someone once stood tall so you could live quietly, type thank you in the comments. And mean it. In the spring, Caleb received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside, a folded piece of paper and a single Marine Corps insignia. The note read, "You're carrying the stories now. Make sure the grass never dies." He kept it in his wallet. Years passed. Caleb grew up. as boys do. He left Elliston for college, for service, for love, for life. But he came back because someone had to mow the cemetery. On the 50th anniversary of Parker Delaney's death, a new plaque was added beside his grave. Not from the town, from Caleb. It read, "You were never forgotten." He made sure of that. And I will too. Have you known someone who lit a torch and handed it to you? Tell us their name. Let the world remember what they gave. At the bench, things still appear. A folded uniform sleeve. A drawing by a child. A patch from a foreign war. No one touches them. No one dares. Because some memorials don't need marble. They need footsteps. And care. And silence. And a mower that starts every Sunday. If you like this story, please like and subscribe to the channel. Let YouTube promote stories of kindness.